West Virginia, 1927. The bride who married her father to preserve the family name. In the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where coal dust settled on everything like a shroud of secrecy, the Thornhill family lived in complete isolation, 15 miles from the nearest town of Beckley. Their farmstead, perched on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, had been in the family for 3 generations, passed down through a bloodline that grew increasingly tangled with each passing decade. Margaret Thornhill was 21 years old in the spring of 1927. With pale skin that rarely saw direct sunlight and eyes that held a disturbing familiarity to those of her father. Samuel Thornhill, a 48-year-old widower who had buried 3 wives before her mother. The isolated property consisted of a weathered 2-story house with crumbling stone foundations, a barn that leaned precariously to one side, and 70 acres of rocky, unforgiving land that yielded barely enough crops to sustain the family through harsh winters. Samuel Thornhill was a man of imposing stature, standing over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders built from years of manual labor. His face bore the deep lines of someone who had lived a life of hardship, with sunken cheeks and a jaw that jutted forward unnaturally, a trait that would become horrifyingly significant as the story unfolded. He had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. And with that land came a twisted sense of duty that had poisoned the Thornhill bloodline for nearly a century. The family's isolation was not accidental. The Thornhills had deliberately cut themselves off from the surrounding communities in the 1850s, when Margaret's great-grandfather Ezekiel Thornhill became convinced that outsiders would corrupt the family's supposed purity and claim to the land. He forbade his children from marrying anyone outside the family, a decree that was enforced with brutal consequences for those who dared to disobey. Over the decades, cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and the family tree became less of a tree and more of a twisted vine that grew back into itself. Margaret's mother, Elizabeth, had been Samuel's first cousin. She died giving birth to Margaret's younger brother, Thomas, who lived only 3 days before succumbing to what the local doctor who briefly examined him described as severe internal malformations. Elizabeth herself had been the product of a union between siblings, and her own health had been fragile throughout her short life. She suffered from chronic respiratory problems, unexplained seizures, and a pronounced curvature of the spine that made even simple tasks agonizing. By 1927, the Thornhill family had dwindled to just 4 members: Samuel, Margaret, her Aunt Clara, who was actually her father's sister and also his second wife who had died in childbirth, and Margaret's grandfather, Jacob, a man in his 70s who could barely speak due to severe cognitive decline and physical deformities that left him confined to a chair in the corner of the main room. On a cold March morning, Samuel made an announcement that would seal Margaret's fate. Standing in the kitchen while Margaret prepared a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried apples, he declared that she would become his wife within the month. His reasoning was chillingly simple. The family name must continue. The land must remain in Thornhill hands, and there were no other suitable options. Margaret's hands trembled as she stirred the pot, her mind racing with the horror of what her father was proposing. Yet she had been raised in such complete isolation that she barely understood that there could be any other way. The Thornhill property was surrounded by dense forest, the nearest neighbor living over 8 miles away across treacherous mountain terrain. Margaret had ventured beyond the property boundaries only twice in her entire life, both times accompanying her father to Beckley to purchase essential supplies they couldn't produce themselves. The town had seemed overwhelming to her, with its paved streets, automobiles, and crowds of people who stared at her with a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. She didn't understand their stares then, but years later, others would recognize the telltale signs of inbreeding in her features: eyes set slightly too far apart, a flattened nasal bridge, and fingers that curved at unusual angles. Samuel justified the union with twisted logic rooted in the family's dark history. He explained to Margaret that their ancestors had maintained the bloodline's purity for generations, that outsiders carried diseases and moral corruption, and that it was her sacred duty to continue the Thornhill legacy. He spoke of her great-great-grandmother who had married her own father in 1834, and how that union had supposedly kept the family strong and the land secure. What he didn't mention were the countless infants who had died within days of birth, the children who never learned to walk or speak, and the adults who suffered from conditions that doctors couldn't explain or treat. The wedding was planned for April 15, 1927, to be conducted in the Thornhill home with no witnesses outside the family. Samuel had obtained a marriage license through fraudulent means, claiming Margaret's mother's maiden name as her surname and listing himself under a false name, creating documentation that would later become crucial evidence in unraveling the family's crimes. He had learned this deception from his own father, who had employed similar tactics when marrying his sister decades earlier. Margaret existed in a state of numb resignation during those weeks. She had no education beyond basic reading and arithmetic that her mother had taught her before dying. She had no friends, no contact with the outside world, and no conception of the laws or moral standards that governed normal society. Her entire universe consisted of the farmstead, her father's commands, and the vague, disturbing stories of ancestors who had made similar choices. She spent her days performing household chores, tending to the few chickens and pigs they kept, and caring for her grandfather, whose condition deteriorated daily. The Appalachian spring of 1927 arrived with unusual coldness. Ice still clung to the shadowed hollows, and the wind that swept through the valley carried a bitter chill that seemed to penetrate the very walls of the Thornhill house. On the morning of April 14th, the day before the planned ceremony, Margaret stood at her bedroom window looking out over the bleak landscape. The mountains rose like prison walls around the property, their peaks still dusted with snow. She had never known any other life, yet something deep within her recognized the profound wrongness of what was about to occur. That afternoon, Samuel made preparations for the ceremony with meticulous care. He cleaned the main room, arranged furniture to create a makeshift altar, and laid out a dress that had belonged to his mother, who had worn it when marrying her own uncle in 1872. The dress was yellowed with age, smelling of mothballs and decay, with intricate lace that had been mended countless times. He instructed Margaret to bathe and prepare herself, speaking with an authority that left no room for refusal. As evening approached, Margaret sat in the cold water of the metal tub in the kitchen, her body shaking not just from the temperature but from a terror she couldn't fully articulate. She could hear her father moving about upstairs and her grandfather's labored breathing from the main room. The weight of generations of suffering pressed down on her, the accumulated tragedy of a bloodline that had twisted back on itself so many times that it barely resembled humanity anymore. Confirase ja inscrito nes canal, porcas historias que revelamos, aquí snow verdades, probidas que o mundo tentu esconder, evoca mores conhezer, cada detail chocante. The morning of April 15, 1927 dawned gray and oppressive, with low clouds hanging over the Thornhill property like a suffocating blanket. Margaret woke before sunrise, having barely slept through the night, her mind filled with fragmented nightmares and the crushing reality of what this day would bring. She dressed slowly in the ancient wedding gown, the fabric rough against her skin, the waist cinched so tightly she could barely breathe. When she looked at herself in the cracked mirror that hung in her bedroom, she saw a ghost staring back at her, pale and hollow-eyed, already mourning a life that had never truly begun. Samuel had prepared the main room with disturbing formality. He had moved the furniture to create an aisle leading to the fireplace, where he had arranged candles and a worn Bible that had been in the family since before the Civil War. The pages of that Bible contained handwritten records of births, marriages, and deaths dating back to 1831, a genealogical record that would later horrify researchers who studied it. The entries revealed a pattern of intermarriage so extensive that by 1927, Margaret and Samuel shared not just a father-daughter relationship, but were also related through multiple other ancestral lines, making their genetic overlap catastrophically high. The ceremony itself was conducted by Samuel, who appointed himself as both groom and officiant. There were no guests, no witnesses except for Jacob, Margaret's grandfather, who sat slumped in his chair, occasionally making incomprehensible sounds that might have been protests or merely the random utterings of his damaged mind. The old man's face bore the unmistakable marks of generations of inbreeding, a severely receding chin, eyes that didn't quite focus in the same direction, and hands that were twisted into claw-like shapes from congenital deformities. Samuel read from the Bible in a voice that echoed through the cold room, selecting passages about duty, obedience, and the importance of preserving one's lineage. He had written his own vows, which combined religious language with the disturbing ideology that had governed the Thornhill family for decades. He spoke of bloodline purity, of keeping the land within the family, of fulfilling the destiny that their ancestors had established. Margaret stood silent throughout, her lips moving wordlessly, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls of the house, trying to transport her mind anywhere but the present moment. When Samuel placed a ring on Margaret's finger, it was the same ring that had belonged to his mother, who had worn it when marrying her uncle, and before that, it had belonged to his grandmother, who had worn it when marrying her brother. The gold band was worn thin in places, and inside it bore an inscription in letters so faded they were nearly illegible. Blood eternal. 1834. This ring had witnessed nearly a century of prohibited unions, each one adding another layer of genetic damage to the family line. After the ceremony, Samuel declared them husband and wife, and Margaret became legally bound to her own father in the eyes of whatever twisted authority he claimed. The marriage certificate, filled out with false information, was placed in the family Bible alongside the other records of unions that violated every law of nature and society. Samuel seemed satisfied, even triumphant, as if he had accomplished something of great importance rather than perpetrated an act of profound violation. Life on the Thornhill farm continued with a nightmarish new normal. Margaret moved her belongings from her small bedroom to the larger room that had belonged to Samuel, a space that still contained reminders of the 3 women who had died there before her: her mother Elizabeth, her Aunt Clara, and another aunt named Ruth, who had perished from complications during a miscarriage in 1919. The room smelled of old wood and something else, something Margaret couldn't identify, but that made her stomach turn whenever she entered. The spring of 1927 progressed slowly in the mountains. Samuel worked the land with the same brutal efficiency he applied to everything else, clearing rocks from fields, repairing fences, and preparing the soil for planting. Margaret performed her duties with mechanical precision, cooking meals, maintaining the house, and caring for Jacob, whose condition worsened daily. The old man seemed to sense that something terrible had occurred, sometimes reaching out to Margaret with his twisted hands and making sounds that might have been attempts at words or simply expressions of anguish. By June, Margaret began to show the first signs of pregnancy. Her morning sickness was severe, far worse than what her mother had experienced, according to the journals Elizabeth had kept. Margaret found these journals hidden in a trunk in the attic, along with other family documents that painted a horrifying picture of the Thornhill legacy. Elizabeth had written extensively about her own suffering, her fear of bringing children into the world, and her knowledge of the genetic catastrophe that ran through the family. She had documented the deaths of 4 infants before Thomas, each one born with deformities so severe they couldn't survive more than a few hours. Among the documents, Margaret discovered photographs, some dating back to the 1880s when photography had become more accessible. The images showed Thornhill family members across generations, and the progression of physical deterioration was unmistakable. Earlier photographs showed people with relatively normal features, but with each generation, the signs of inbreeding became more pronounced. By the 1900s, family members displayed severe facial asymmetry, unusual bone structure, and expressions that suggested profound cognitive impairment. One photograph particularly disturbed Margaret. It showed a family gathering from 1901 with about 15 people arranged in front of the Thornhill house. Among them were several children, and Margaret could see clear evidence of severe developmental problems: enlarged heads, twisted limbs, vacant stares. In the back row stood a young woman who looked remarkably like Margaret herself, identified on the back of the photograph as Sarah Thornhill, aged 19, married to her father Jacob Thornhill. June 1901. This Sarah had died in childbirth later that year, along with her infant, both buried in the small cemetery behind the house where dozens of Thornhills rested, most of them having lived brief, painful lives. The discovery of these documents awakened something in Margaret that had been dormant under years of isolation and indoctrination. She began to understand that what had happened to her was not normal, not acceptable, and not justified by any real moral or religious authority. She started to see her father not as the head of a noble family preserving an important legacy, but as a man perpetuating a cycle of suffering that had destroyed countless lives. However, escape seemed impossible. The farm was miles from the nearest settlement. Margaret had no money, no transportation, and no knowledge of how to navigate the world beyond the mountain. Additionally, she was now pregnant, carrying a child that would inevitably bear the genetic burden of extreme consanguinity. The father of her child was also her father, creating a genetic nightmare that would almost certainly result in severe abnormalities. Through the summer months, Margaret's condition advanced, and with it came complications that terrified even Samuel. She experienced severe cramping, episodes of bleeding, and fainting spells that left her unconscious for hours. Samuel, who had witnessed similar problems with his previous wives, began to show signs of concern, though whether this stemmed from genuine care or merely from the fear of losing another potential mother for his heirs was unclear. In late August, a rare visitor arrived at the Thornhill property. Reverend Thomas Blackwood, an itinerant preacher who traveled through the remote mountain communities, had heard rumors of a family living in extreme isolation and felt compelled to visit. Samuel met him at the property boundary with a shotgun, initially refusing entry, but the Reverend was persistent. He claimed he only wanted to offer spiritual guidance and assistance, and eventually Samuel reluctantly allowed him to approach the house, though he was forbidden from entering. Reverend Blackwood was a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a genuine concern for the isolated families scattered throughout the Appalachian region. He had seen poverty, ignorance, and suffering in his travels, but nothing had prepared him for what he observed at the Thornhill farm. From his position outside the house, he could see Margaret through a window, her pregnant form moving slowly in the dim interior. He noticed her unusual features, the way she moved with difficulty, and something in her expression that spoke of profound despair. The Reverend engaged Samuel in conversation, trying to assess the situation. He asked about the family, about their connection to any church, about their needs. Samuel's answers were guarded and often contradictory. He claimed Margaret was his wife, but couldn't provide coherent details about where they had married or who had performed the ceremony. When asked about other family members, Samuel mentioned only Jacob, claiming he was Margaret's grandfather, though the Reverend noticed strange inconsistencies in the timeline Samuel provided. Before leaving, Reverend Blackwood managed to catch Margaret's eye through the window. In that brief moment of contact, he saw something that disturbed him deeply. A silent plea for help, a desperation that transcended words. He made a mental note of the property's location and resolved to report his concerns to authorities in Beckley. Though he had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, only a profound sense that something terrible was occurring in the isolated Thornhill home. Chapter 3. The Birth of Tragedy. September 1927 brought early frost to the mountains, and with it came the beginning of Margaret's labor. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start, but the final weeks had been especially brutal. Margaret's body, already weakened by generations of genetic damage, struggled under the burden of carrying a child conceived through such extreme consanguinity. She had swelled to an abnormal size, her abdomen distended far beyond what seemed natural, and she suffered from constant pain that no amount of rest could relieve. The labor began on the night of September 23rd with contractions that were unusually violent and irregular. Samuel, who had assisted with previous births in the family, immediately recognized that this was different from the others. Margaret's screams echoed through the house and out into the dark forest surrounding the property. Primal sounds of agony that seemed to disturb even the wildlife, causing birds to flee from nearby trees and the family's few remaining animals to pace nervously in their pens. For 3 days, Margaret labored in the upstairs bedroom, her suffering beyond description. Samuel attempted to assist, but he had no real medical knowledge. Only the crude techniques passed down through generations of Thornhills who had been forced to manage childbirth in isolation. He tried to comfort Margaret, to encourage her, but his words rang hollow even to his own ears. Deep down, he knew what was coming, had seen it before with his other wives. But the compulsion to continue the bloodline overrode any compassion or reason. Jacob, confined to his chair downstairs, seemed to sense the catastrophe unfolding above him. He made continuous sounds throughout those 3 days, sometimes like weeping, sometimes like attempts at speech. Perhaps, in whatever remained of his damaged mind, he remembered his own daughter dying in similar circumstances, remembered the countless Thornhill women who had perished trying to bring genetically doomed children into the world. On the morning of September 26th, as gray dawn light filtered through the bedroom window, the child was finally born. The infant emerged into a world that should have never received it. A tiny body bearing the accumulated genetic errors of 5 generations of incestuous unions. Samuel, who had witnessed numerous births with complications, stood frozen as he beheld his child, his grandchild, his daughter's child. A being whose very existence was a testament to the Thornhill family's crimes against nature. The infant girl lived for approximately 2 hours. In that brief span, she never opened her eyes, never made a sound beyond a weak, gurgling respiration. Her body displayed severe abnormalities. A skull that had not properly formed, leaving portions of the brain exposed. Limbs that were twisted and shortened. Internal organs that Samuel could see were positioned incorrectly even without medical training. He wrapped her in a cloth, and she died in his arms while Margaret, hemorrhaging and barely conscious, lay on the blood-soaked bed. Margaret survived the birth, but barely. She had lost an enormous amount of fluid, and infection set in within days despite Samuel's crude attempts at care. She developed a fever that climbed steadily, and she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out for her mother, sometimes weeping, sometimes lying in an eerie silence that was somehow worse than the screams. Samuel buried the infant in the family's cemetery, in an unmarked grave among dozens of others, most of them so small they could only have been children. During one of Margaret's lucid moments in early October, as she lay in the bedroom recovering slowly from the traumatic birth, she made a decision that would ultimately lead to the Thornhill family's exposure. She asked Samuel to bring her paper and a pen, claiming she wanted to record the birth in the family Bible as was tradition. Instead, while Samuel worked in the fields, Margaret wrote a letter, pouring out the truth of her situation with startling clarity despite her weakened state and limited education. The letter was addressed to Reverend Blackwood, the only person from outside the family she had ever spoken to, even if only through a window. In painstaking detail, she described her true relationship to Samuel, the circumstances of their marriage, the pregnancy, the birth, and the death of the infant. She wrote about the family's history of intermarriage, about the documents and photographs she had found, about the graves of all the children and women who had died because of the Thornhill bloodline's toxic legacy. She begged for help, not for herself, but to prevent Samuel from continuing the cycle, from forcing her to endure another pregnancy, from creating more doomed children. If you've ever felt the weight of a secret too heavy to bear, type in the comments. Some truths must be told, no matter the cost. Hiding the letter was difficult in the small house where Samuel monitored everything, but Margaret managed to conceal it inside the mattress, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. Weeks passed, and her strength gradually returned, though she would never be the same. The birth had damaged her body in ways that would cause chronic pain for the rest of her life, and the psychological trauma had left her in a state of deep depression that manifested as long periods of silence and detachment. By November, the first snows began to fall on the mountain, isolating the Thornhill property even further. Samuel had harvested what he could from the fields, stored provisions for winter, and settled into the grim routine of survival. He seemed satisfied that Margaret had survived and was already speaking of trying again for a child in the spring. Words that filled Margaret with such horror that she sometimes considered ending her own life, though she lacked the means or the courage. The opportunity Margaret had been waiting for came in mid-December, when Samuel made one of his rare trips to Beckley to purchase supplies that couldn't be produced on the farm. He would be gone for at least 2 days given the difficult journey and winter conditions. As soon as he departed, Margaret retrieved the letter from its hiding place. She had no way to mail it herself, but she formed a desperate plan. The nearest neighbor, a farmer named William Patterson, who lived 8 miles away across rugged terrain, was her only hope. Margaret had never met Patterson, but her mother had mentioned him years ago as someone who occasionally traded goods with Samuel. Determined to get her letter to someone who could help, Margaret bundled herself in layers of worn clothing, took a small amount of food, and set out into the December cold on foot. The journey nearly killed her. The temperature was well below freezing, snow covered the ground, and Margaret's body, still recovering from childbirth just 3 months earlier, was not prepared for such exertion. She fell multiple times, became disoriented in the unfamiliar forest, and began to suffer from hypothermia. After what she estimated was 5 or 6 hours of struggle, she saw smoke rising from a chimney in the distance and summoned her last reserves of strength to reach it. William Patterson and his wife, Edith, were shocked when they found Margaret collapsed on their porch on the evening of December 18, 1927. They brought her inside, warmed her by the fire, and listened in growing horror as she gasped out fragments of her story. Margaret gave them the letter, begged them to ensure it reached Reverend Blackwood or any authority who could intervene, and then lost consciousness from exhaustion and exposure. The Pattersons were simple people, but they possessed the basic human decency that had been completely absent from the Thornhill home. They cared for Margaret through the night, and the next morning, William Patterson rode to Beckley through the snow carrying Margaret's letter. He went directly to the sheriff's office, where he handed over the document and described finding the young woman nearly frozen to death on his property. Sheriff Robert Hensley read Margaret's letter with increasing disbelief and revulsion. The claim seemed almost too horrific to be credible, but the details were too specific and too consistent to be mere fabrication. He immediately organized a small group of deputies and a physician, Dr. James Morton, who had experience with rural mountain families and the medical problems that sometimes arose from isolated populations. The group, including William Patterson as a guide, made their way to the Thornhill property on December 20th. Samuel had returned from his supply trip the previous day and discovered Margaret's absence. When the sheriff and his deputies arrived, they found him in a state of rage and panic, pacing the grounds and shouting Margaret's name into the surrounding forest. The confrontation that followed would expose one of the most disturbing cases of familial consanguinity ever documented in West Virginia history. Sheriff Hensley approached the Thornhill property with his hand on his service revolver, uncertain what kind of man they would be dealing with. Samuel Thornhill emerged from the house as the group arrived, his face transitioning from hope that Margaret had returned to fury when he recognized William Patterson among the visitors. He demanded to know where Margaret was, claiming his wife had run away and needed to be brought back immediately. The use of the word wife in reference to someone Patterson had seen as barely more than a girl made the farmer's stomach turn. The sheriff presented Samuel with Margaret's letter, and informed him that they were there to investigate serious allegations. Samuel's response was defiant rather than defensive. He insisted that he had done nothing wrong, that his marriage to Margaret was legitimate, and that everything he had done was in accordance with family tradition and his rights as the head of the household. His complete lack of shame or recognition of wrongdoing was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the initial encounter. When the sheriff demanded to see the marriage certificate, Samuel produced the fraudulent document he had created, listing Margaret under her mother's maiden name and himself under a false identity. Dr. Morton, who had accompanied the group, immediately noted the discrepancies in the unusual circumstances. He also observed the property itself, the deteriorating buildings, the small cemetery with its numerous graves, and through the window the figure of Jacob Thornhill, whose severe physical deformities were visible even from a distance. The sheriff placed Samuel under arrest on suspicion of fraud, and the group entered the house to gather evidence and assess the situation. What they found inside surpassed even the disturbing details in Margaret's letter. Dr. Morton examined Jacob Thornhill and documented severe congenital abnormalities consistent with multiple generations of inbreeding, skeletal malformations, profound cognitive impairment, and organ dysfunction. The old man was in such poor condition that the doctor estimated he would not survive more than a few months without proper medical care. Throughout the house, the investigators discovered the documentary evidence of the Thornhill family's history. The Bible with its genealogical record showed a pattern of consanguineous marriages spanning nearly a century. Photographs revealed the progressive physical deterioration across generations. Elizabeth's journals provided heartbreaking firsthand accounts of the suffering endured by women who had been forced into similar situations. Birth and death records showed that of approximately 40 children born to the Thornhill family since 1850, fewer than 10 had survived past the age of 5. In the small cemetery behind the house, they counted 37 graves, most unmarked or with simple wooden markers that had rotted away. The fresh grave from September, where Samuel had buried Margaret's infant, was the most recent addition. Dr. Morton examined the burial site and estimated from its size that it contained the remains of a newborn, or very young infant, consistent with Margaret's account. The evidence was overwhelming, but the legal situation was complex. In 1927, while marriage between parent and child was absolutely prohibited and considered both illegal and immoral, the enforcement of such laws in remote rural areas was inconsistent. The fraudulent marriage certificate complicated matters, as did questions about Margaret's consent and her capacity to understand what was happening to her given her lifetime of isolation and indoctrination. Samuel was transported to the county jail in Beckley, still protesting his innocence and claiming that outsiders had no right to interfere with his family's private affairs. His complete inability to comprehend that he had done anything wrong revealed how thoroughly the Thornhill family's isolation had warped their understanding of basic human ethics and legal norms. During his initial interrogation, he spoke openly about the family's history of intermarriage, describing it as a tradition that kept the bloodline pure and the land secure, showing no awareness that these practices were the source of immense suffering rather than family strength. Margaret remained with the Patterson family during the initial investigation, slowly recovering her strength and beginning to process the trauma of the previous months. Edith Patterson provided maternal care that Margaret had never known, treating her with gentleness and respect. For the first time in her life, Margaret experienced what a normal household looked like, with basic courtesies, healthy relationships, and an absence of the oppressive fear that had permeated every moment of her existence at the Thornhill farm. Jacob Thornhill was transported to a county poor farm where he could receive minimal medical care, though Dr. Morton privately believed the old man would not survive long outside the environment he had known his entire life. Indeed, Jacob died on January 8, 1928, less than 3 weeks after being removed from the property. The death certificate listed multiple causes, including heart failure, respiratory complications, and what the doctor described as congenital abnormalities consistent with hereditary degeneration. The case against Samuel Thornhill proceeded slowly through the legal system. He was charged with fraud for the false marriage certificate, with endangerment for the circumstances that led to the infant's death, and with a range of other offenses that prosecutors struggled to articulate within the legal framework of the time. There was no specific statute against what he had done to Margaret, no clear legal category for forcing one's daughter into marriage and pregnancy, because such acts were considered so fundamentally beyond the bounds of civilized behavior that lawmakers had never imagined needing to explicitly prohibit them. The trial, held in April 1928, attracted attention from across West Virginia and even from national newspapers. Journalists descended on Beckley to report on what they described as a case of mountain degeneracy and backwoods barbarism. often with sensationalized language that showed more interest in shock value than in understanding the human tragedy at the heart of the story. Margaret was called to testify, and her quiet, detailed account of her life and suffering moved even the most hardened observers in the courtroom. Dr. Morton provided expert testimony about the genetic consequences of consanguinity, explaining in terms accessible to the jury how intermarriage between close relatives led to the expression of harmful recessive traits and the accumulation of genetic damage across generations. He presented photographs of the Thornhill family across time, showing the progressive physical deterioration. He described the infant born in September, whose deformities were so severe that survival was impossible. He made clear that this was not a case of ignorance or accident, but of deliberate choices repeated across generations despite mounting evidence of their catastrophic consequences. Samuel Thornhill showed no remorse during the trial. He maintained that he had acted within his rights as head of the family and that the traditions of his ancestors were being unjustly attacked by people who didn't understand the importance of keeping bloodlines and property within the family. His testimony revealed a mind that had been so thoroughly shaped by generations of isolation and twisted ideology that he was genuinely incapable of seeing himself as anything other than a victim of persecution. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, spoke at length about the case's broader implications. He noted that while the Thornhill family's extreme isolation was unusual, the practice of marriage between cousins and other close relatives was not uncommon in rural mountain communities, and that this case should serve as a warning about the dangers of such practices. He sentenced Samuel to 20 years in prison, the maximum allowed under the combined charges. The Thornhill property was sold to pay legal fees and restitution, though few buyers were interested in land with such a dark history. Eventually, a timber company purchased it at a steep discount, planning to harvest the trees and then abandon the cleared land. The house was demolished in 1929, and the cemetery was relocated to a county burial ground, though many of the remains were so deteriorated or poorly marked that identification was impossible. Margaret's recovery was long and painful, both physically and psychologically. She remained with the Patterson family for several months before eventually moving to Beckley, where charitable organizations helped her find work and housing. She never married again, never had children, and rarely spoke about her past. Those who knew her described a quiet, sad woman who seemed permanently marked by experiences that most people couldn't even imagine. The Thornhill case faded from public attention within a few years, displaced by other scandals and the onset of the Great Depression, which brought economic hardships that overshadowed individual tragedies. Samuel Thornhill died in prison in 1943 at the age of 64 from complications related to tuberculosis. His death certificate listed no next of kin, no one to claim his body, which was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave. The bloodline he had been so desperate to preserve ended with him, the last of the Thornhills, the final chapter in a family history defined by suffering and genetic catastrophe. Margaret lived until 1967, dying at the age of 61 from heart failure. She had spent the last 4 decades of her life working as a seamstress in Beckley, living in a small apartment and maintaining minimal contact with others. Friends described her as kind but distant, a woman who seemed to carry an invisible burden that prevented her from ever fully engaging with the world. She left no diary, no memoir, no detailed account of her experiences, beyond the original letter that had sparked the investigation. Perhaps the memories were too painful to revisit, or perhaps she simply wanted to let them fade into the silence she had maintained for most of her life. The medical and genealogical records from the Thornhill case were preserved in county archives and later became valuable resources for researchers studying the effects of consanguinity on human populations. Dr. Morton published a paper in a medical journal in 1929, detailing the genetic consequences observed in the Thornhill family. Though he changed names and some identifying details to protect Margaret's privacy, his work contributed to growing scientific understanding of hereditary conditions and the dangers of inbreeding, helping to establish medical guidelines that persist to this day. The Thornhill Family Bible, with its detailed genealogical records, was eventually donated to the West Virginia State Archives, where it remains as a sobering historical document. Researchers who have studied it have noted that the pattern of intermarriage was not random but followed a deliberate strategy aimed at keeping property within the family and maintaining what the Thornhills perceived as bloodline purity. This ideology, rooted in extreme isolation and reinforced across generations, created a self-perpetuating cycle of suffering that only ended when outside intervention finally occurred. The broader social context of the Thornhill case reveals uncomfortable truths about rural Appalachian communities in the early 20th century. While extreme cases like the Thornhills were rare, marriage between first cousins was relatively common and socially accepted in many isolated mountain settlements. The lack of access to education, medical care, and outside contact meant that the genetic risks of such practices were poorly understood, and traditional family structures often prioritized property preservation over individual well-being. The coal industry, which dominated West Virginia's economy in this period, contributed to the isolation of families like the Thornhills. Mining companies controlled most accessible land, pushing small independent farmers into increasingly remote and marginal areas. The Thornhill property, with its rocky soil and difficult terrain, represented the kind of holding that could not compete economically, leading to the family's poverty and further isolation. This economic marginalization created conditions where extreme family dynamics could persist undetected for generations. Reverend Blackwood, who had first raised concerns about the Thornhill family, continued his ministry in the region until his death in 1951. He often spoke about the case in his sermons, using it as an example of the importance of community connection and the dangers of extreme isolation. He advocated for better roads, schools, and medical services in rural areas, arguing that the Thornhill tragedy could have been prevented if the family had been integrated into a broader community with access to education and outside perspectives. The Patterson family, who had provided refuge for Margaret, never sought recognition or compensation for their role in the case. William and Edith Patterson continued farming their land and occasionally mentioned the events of December 1927, but always with sadness rather than pride. William Patterson testified at Samuel's trial, describing finding Margaret near death on his porch, and his testimony was noted for its simple dignity and clear moral conviction that what had been done to her was profoundly wrong. The legal precedents established by the Thornhill case influenced subsequent legislation in West Virginia. The state strengthened its marriage laws, implemented stricter verification processes for marriage licenses, and enhanced penalties for fraud and endangerment in domestic situations. While these changes came too late to help Margaret, they potentially prevented similar cases from occurring, or at least made them easier to prosecute if they were discovered. The psychological impact of extreme consanguinity, as exemplified by Margaret's experience, became a subject of study in the emerging field of clinical psychology. Her symptoms, what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and complex trauma, were poorly understood in 1927. But her case file provided valuable documentation of the long-term mental health consequences of such experiences. Modern psychologists who have reviewed the historical records note that Margaret received virtually no mental health support beyond basic charity and kindness, yet somehow managed to build a stable if limited life for herself. The cemetery where the Thornhill remains were relocated has become an anonymous resting place, with most of the graves marked only by numbers in the county registry. Researchers who have visited the site describe it as unremarkable, a small section of a larger burial ground with no indication of the tragic stories attached to those buried there. The infant born to Margaret in September 1927 lies in one of these numbered graves, her brief existence documented only in medical records and court testimony. In the decades since the Thornhill case, genetic science has advanced enormously, confirming and expanding upon Dr. Morton's observations about the dangers of consanguinity. Modern genetics has revealed that children born from parent-child incestuous relationships have approximately a 50% chance of serious birth defects or genetic disorders, and that the accumulation of such relationships across generations virtually guarantees catastrophic health consequences. The Thornhill family's history provides a tragic real-world confirmation of these scientific principles. The location of the former Thornhill property has been reclaimed by Forest. The timber company that purchased the land harvested what they wanted and abandoned the rest. Today, few traces remain of the house, barn, or fields that once comprised the family's isolated world. Hikers occasionally pass through the area, unaware of the dark history beneath their feet. Nature has erased the physical evidence, but the documentary record ensures that the Thornhill story endures as a cautionary tale. Margaret's original letter, the document that initiated the investigation and ultimately ended the Thornhill family's cycle of abuse, is preserved in the West Virginia State Archives under climate-controlled conditions. Quote, "The handwriting is shaky, the spelling imperfect, the language simple, but the emotional power of the document remains undiminished. Reading it today, nearly a century later, one can still feel the desperation of a young woman reaching out from unimaginable circumstances, finding the courage to speak a truth that had been buried in silence for generations. The broader lesson of the Thornhill case extends beyond the specific circumstances of one family's genetic nightmare. It speaks to the dangers of extreme isolation, the importance of education and outside contact, and the devastating consequences when traditional authority goes unchecked by broader social norms. The Thornhill family believed they were preserving something valuable through their practices, but they were actually destroying it, generation by generation, until nothing remained but suffering and genetic ruin. West Virginia, 1927. The bride who married her father to preserve the family name. But there was no preservation, only destruction. No honored legacy, only a cautionary tale. No family continuity, only an ending so complete that even the family name itself disappeared from the records. Remembered now only in archived documents, and the occasional scholarly paper examining the darkest possibilities of human isolation and genetic catastrophe. If you watched until here, it's because you appreciated this story. Leave a comment saying I watched until here, so I can get to know you and know who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. If this story impacted you, hit the like button, subscribe to this channel to discover more hidden truths that history tried to bury, and share this video with someone who needs to understand that some silences must be broken. The Thornhill family's tragedy reminds us that isolation and secrecy protect only those who benefit from them, never their victims.